rhetorical invention. Invention meaning, in the original meaning of that term in the English language, how to find out arguments, how to invent them. So it's Cicero's text that you really would have gone through, line by line. And I myself think that it's chiefly that text that Shakespeare has in his mind as he's writing this play. Actually, I think he could well have had the book on his desk as he's writing, so closely is he following it in some sections of the play. And if you think that Ben Jonson was right to say that Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek, then that is really nonsense. That's just a disappointed rival. Very bad to have been a rival of Shakespeare. He was a pretty good playwright. He knew Latin superbly well. And John Aubrey, in his biography of Shakespeare, says he knew it pretty well and kept it up in adult life. And it's clear that he can just read these texts without any difficulty. And it's principally the De Inventione that he's reading. Now, classical rhetoric is mainly judicial rhetoric. And I think we could say, without undue simplification, that what you would have learned at school was three main and connected claims about judicial speech. And my argument this afternoon is simply that you have to know those three claims in order to have a clue about what's going on in this pivotal scene in The Merchant of Venice. So I'm now going to have to spend a bit of time on those three claims. And this reveals the weakness of the kind of historian I am, which is that I'm always trying to contextualize text to show you what text you need to have in your head in order to understand other texts. What that means, to put it more pejoratively, is that there's a terrible amount of machinery for me to wheel onto the stage before anything gets even halfway interesting. And so in the first half of this lecture, it's wheeling the machinery on stage, I'm afraid, that you're going to get. And that's what I'm going to use the slides to help me out with. So, three claims, and here is the first and the most basic one. Whenever someone has a case to put forward in court, this is Cicero speaking, and I've put the references to Cicero there. You can follow them out if you want. Or indeed, if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, just send me an email and I can send it to you if you want to follow any of this out. But I'm also putting the references to the Rhetoric ad Tyrannium. And I think it's Cicero whom Shakespeare is reading, as we shall see. So, the first thought is, whenever someone has a case to put forward in court, this is because there is a cause in controversy. I can't too much stress that phrase, a cause in controversy. That's to say, there's a dispute between two opposing parties. Now, that being so, there's consequently going to be a question. They love this idea of a quaestio. Shakespeare is always asking, well, what is the question? In fact, it's his most famous line. To be or not to be. That is the quaestio. That's deliberative rhetoric. He's trying to decide on a course of action. Here we're in judicial rhetoric. There's going to have to be a question in need of adjudication. You're in front of a judge. You're in a court. The plaintiff raises the quaestio. You have to give the response. That blank, by the way, is deliberate. My experience, if you use PowerPoint, is that if you leave it up there, no one listens to anything. They just read the PowerPoint over and over again. So I'm going to get rid of it until we need the next one. Okay, there's the first claim. So the second claim is more complicated. The question that needs to be adjudicated. What is the question? The question that needs to be adjudicated can take one of three forms in judicial rhetoric. And this gives rise to three types of plea. All of this, by the way, goes into common law. Anglo-American common law is actually taken from classical rhetoric in its vocabulary. Now, these three forms are called the constitutions of the cause. How is it constituted? The constitutions of the cause. And Shakespeare is extremely interested in all these forms. And as I go through, I'll try to illustrate that from different examples of what Professor Smith kindly mentioned I call the forensic plays. So, three types of constitution of a cause, and the first is called the conjectural one. Now here, the question is about whether some action or event took place. Did something happen? There could be a question about that. For example, consider at the beginning of Hamlet. The ghost appears and says he was murdered. But everyone in Denmark believes that he was stung by a serpent. The question is, was he murdered? And in a way, the play is all about that question. Hamlet's got to find out, was he murdered? And of course, he was telling the truth. Second question, there can be what's called the legal issue. That's extremely confusing because, of course, all of this is legal. And the Latin is probably better. This is the negotialis, what has to be negotiated. And now here the question arises, as the Latin says, a scripto, that's to say out of something inscribed, out of something written. And so the question is about the correct interpretation of a legal text. That can always raise big questions in court. So there's another question. How are we to understand a text? Now, that often happens in Shakespeare's plays as well. Indeed, one of the longest speeches in the whole of the canon is the Archbishop's speech at the beginning of Henry V, when the king asks the question,
of the Archbishop, remember, is it lawful for me to invade France? And the Archbishop, it's a very tedious response he gives. It takes up a tremendous amount of time, and it's usually cut in modern productions. But the problem is that the English claim on France comes via the female line, but according to the ancient law of Pharamond, as the Archbishop tells us, no women can lawfully inherit in Salic lands, and France is said to be a Salic land. Now, the Archbishop has the text of the law in front of him, and he says, well, what the text says is that you can't have a claim in Salic lands through the female line, but France is not a Salic land. The Salic lands are in Germany. Furthermore, there is no additional French law that forbids female succession. This takes him a very long time, and then the king says, so it's all right, is it? And he says, yeah, you can go ahead. So that's the legal cause. Now, the rhetoricians have a very important warning at this point about the legal cause, and this, you've got to consider two legal hermeneutics, and it remains the fundamental legal hermeneutic issue, which is warning at this point about the legal cause, and this takes you into the most fundamental issue in legal hermeneutics, and it remains the fundamental legal hermeneutic issue, which is, you've got to consider two questions before you go into court, or else you can really get into difficulties in court. And the first is this. What do you want to highlight? Do you want to focus exclusively on what Cicero calls the verba ipsa, the very words of the text? Or do you want also the mind of the writer to be considered, sometimes called the intentio scriptoris? Do you think that interpretation, underlying intentions and purposes also critically matter? Notice that the Archbishop goes for the verba ipsa. He has the text and he says, look, it says Salic lands and France is not a Salic land. So he thinks that you go for the wording of the text and what it does not say. So there's the one thing. You've got to be really careful about that. Here's the other thing you have to be really careful about. You have to be very careful about contrary laws. Your case may be good in law. You can still lose if it can be shown by your adversary that your case is in conflict with the requirements of another law, which takes precedence over this one. Now, Cicero is very interested in this because you really need to know the law. I quote, this is the De Inventione, we're in 144. When one law permits or orders something to be done, while another forbids it, this kind of contradiction can undermine your case, because it may be open to your adversary to argue, I'm still translating Cicero, that the law supporting their side is concerned with matters of greater importance, and is therefore the law that must be imposed by the judge. So your case may be good in law, but you're still going to lose. And notice how careful the Archbishop was to point out that there was no contrary law. There could have been a contrary law in France, but he has to say that there's no contrary law. Okay, there's the second possibility, the legal issue. Here's the third, and this is called, again, the terminology is very unfortunate because this is all juridical, but this is called the juridical issue. And this, of course, just refers you to the underlying morality of your legal case. The question is not whether a certain action has been performed, it's agreed what action has been performed, action at law, but was it performed recte, rightly? That's to say without wrong, and was it performed jure, according to jus justice? Was it justly performed? And notice here, jure, it's referring to the Roman law definition of justice, which is jus suum tribuere, giving to each that which it is just they should have. Now, number 3 is the most complicated, I'm sorry to say. We're not there yet. Are you still with me? This is the most complicated case because there are two possibilities here, and here's the first. Your juridical cause may be absoluta, meaning absolved. Absolved from what? Well, absolved from any fault, so that you're able to say, which of course is a wonderful thing to be able to say in a court of law, my plea is in accordance with law and right. And Cicero says, well, you are in luck if you can say that. Now this, of course, you may not manage it, but if you think about it, this is exactly what Brutus claims in Act 3 of Julius Caesar, when he claims that his decision to assassinate Caesar was, as he says, just and honourable, sort of quoting Cicero, because it was necessary to prevent the Roman people from falling into slavery. So assassination would accuse you, but this absolves you, so the cause is absoluta. And of course that's the claim that he puts to the plebs. The alternative, oh now, this is where Cicero really begins to worry on your behalf. The alternative is called assumptive. The Latin verb assumere simply means something has to be added. And that's because your claim is not susceptible of a legal defense. You don't have a legal defense. Cicero says, well, you shouldn't be in court if you don't have a legal defense, but you may find yourself before a court without a legal defense. And in that case, you're just going to have to issue a confession. Now, that's a very serious thing to do in court because you're admitting your adversary's case and you're simply requesting to be pardoned. Now, the rhetoricians go on that this plea for pardon can take one of two forms. With luck, you can claim that there is what you're calling a purgatio. That's to say, you admit the facts, but that you deny that you acted intentionally and deliberately. So you admit the facts, but you deny responsibility. So, for example, that's extremely important in Shakespeare's narrative poem, Lucrece. Lucrece, when she's brought before
her husband and his associates, admits that she had sex with Tarquin, but she claims that she was raped. So that is a purgatio. And of course that's true. But here's the alternative, and this is where you're in real trouble. You have to admit that you acted with foresight and deliberation, and you just plead for mercy. Now, if you are in that position, you must, Cicero says, you must enter your plea straight away. Don't mess around. You've got to enter that plea straight away. That's the best you can do. For example, that's what Isabella does in Act 2 of Measure for Measure when she appears before Angelo to plead on behalf of her brother Claudio. The accusation against Claudio is that he's had sex before marriage with Juliet, and Juliet admits they have, and he admits they have. They're betrothed, but they're not married. So technically, this is a fault in the law. And she comes before Angelo to say, look, all of that is admitted. It's all admitted, but you should pardon them. So that is a deprecatio.
Now, as Cicero says, the problem is that's not a legal plea at all. So what form can a deprecatio take? And I've put the answer there, and it's a strange-looking answer to us, but they are very keen on this in classical rhetoric, which is you've got to appeal to what they call loci communes, common places. Common places. Now, a commonplace is a judgment that everyone accepts. That's the force of calling it common. Everyone will agree with this. So what you've got to try to do is to produce, in demanding mercy and admitting guilt, a series of propositions in the most eloquent form that you possibly can, which people already agree to, and try to show them that if they agree to that, then they should pardon your case. Now, this is so important in the law, in the period in which I'm talking, that a large literature emerges in Shakespeare's England that takes the form of compilations of these sayings. They're called commonplace books, and they're usually organized under the headings that you're going to need if you're going to have to plead for pardon. And so if you open these books, they're usually in two halves, so good and evil, justice versus mercy, revenge versus forgiveness, and so on. And so you can look them up, and you're encouraged in the law schools to look them up and insert them into your legal speeches, because that's going to persuade the jury. They think, oh yes, I already agree to that, it's just a matter of applying it. And some of Shakespeare's plays are filled with these. Measure for Measure is, again, a very good example. In Act 2, if you think of Isabella's meeting with Angelo, she has these 4 long speeches, mounting eloquence, incredible eloquence, but they're all loci communes. And at the end, Angelo says, he's guilty. Why do you put these sayings upon me? He's just not convinced. Okay, there it all is, but there's one other thing that I need finally to say. The last general claim that the rhetoricians are interested in is that whatever type of cause you may be involved in, any of the 3 types, there's a further thing which you've got to think about before you go into court, which is what is the moral standing of this particular cause that I am involved in? And here again, there are 3 possibilities. The moral standing of your cause is possibly, and here you would of course be again in luck, the honest cause. Now, an honest cause is one in which you claim straightforwardly to be telling the truth and standing up for what is right. You claim to be honest. And it's left for your judge to say whether he or she feels that this is an honest statement. So it's so important, for example, in Hamlet, when he goes back to Horatio and says, I met this ghost, and he says he was murdered. But it is an honest ghost, is what he says. It is an honest ghost, i.e. he is telling the truth. The second possibility is that you have something called the causa turpis. Now, luckily for us, Elizabethan England has many Latin to English dictionaries because the boys and some of the girls are learning their Latin. You need a dictionary from Latin into English. If you look up any of these dictionaries, the 2 most famous ones, Cooper's Thesaurus or Thomas's dictionary, turpis, you look up turpis, foul. Turpis, foul. And sometimes honestus is translated as fair. So in Macbeth, when they say fair is foul, wow, that's confusing the categories as much as you possibly could. I suppose the best example of a foul cause in court is when Othello is arraigned by Senator Brabantio, the father of Desdemona, in Act 1 of Othello. On the grounds, Brabantio alleges that Othello has bewitched his daughter. Now, bewitchment, of course, is a capital crime in Elizabethan England, or Jacobean England, but we are by then. And so the very first thing the Duke says is, as often in Shakespeare, the judges are hopelessly partial. He says, who is responsible for this foul proceeding? And then they have to say, well, unfortunately, it's the general who we rather badly need against the Turks. And he says, what? Oh, that's what makes that scene so terrible, is that it's a foul cause that the man they most need has to defend. Okay, so there's the second possibility, and here's the third. The causa admirabilis. Admirabilis, here in the dictionaries again, means strange, contrary to the opinion of the most part. Admirabilis, to be wondered at. And what's strange is that you're bringing this case to court. This is a strange case to bring to court. Now, Cicero says, and I'm quoting here you must move with particular care, because in this case, the minds of those who are about to hear you will initially be alienated from your side of the case. So, he's full of advice always, Cicero, as you know, begin by immediately offering an extremely strong reason in support of your cause, so that the judge is not alienated. he'll think this is odd. This is a really odd case to come to court. Give a very strong reason why it's not odd. Okay, well, there is all the machinery rolled into place. And now, in the second half of the lecture, I want to return to The Merchant of Venice. I just want to offer you a reading of this famous scene, which occupies the whole act, but it's one in which
I hope everything I've said will, it's meant to open up the scene. Okay, before I begin, a word about my quotations. I'm an historian. Historians dread anachronism, and so I do not use a modernized version. I'm using the folio version in the Wells and Taylor edition. And that is through line numbered because, of course, the folio isn't divided into acts and scenes. And so you'll see the through line numbering. But I've also put the modern reference for anyone who wants to follow from the Cambridge edition. Now, let me just remind you where I started. Whenever someone has a judicial case to put forward, there'll always be a question to be answered, and that's because there's a cause in controversy between two adversaries. Now, during the trial scene, all parties reveal a very precise knowledge of this legal vocabulary. Remember, the scene opens with the Duke addressing Antonio the merchant. What? Is Antonio here? Ready, so please your grace. I am sorry for thee. Thou art come to answer a stony adversary. Notice there's a question. It's got to be answered. He has an adversary. Now, the Duke of Venice has deputed the adjudication of Shylock's case to the learned Dr. Bellario. But the learned Dr. Bellario writes a letter saying that he's ill, and he is sending a young but very learned lawyer on his behalf, and that is Dr. Balthazar. But that, of course, is Portia in disguise. And he adds an assurance to the court. I have acquainted him with the cause in controversy, he's quoting Cicero, between the Jew and Antonio the merchant. And as soon as Portia enters, the Duke asks if this is so. And Portia replies, are you acquainted with the difference that holds this present quaestio in the court? Portia, I am informed thoroughly of the causa. They're absolutely in the heart of the judicial rhetoric I'm talking about. Okay, so the next question is, what is the specific nature of Shylock's cause? Well, Shylock himself is very clear. He has agreed a penal bond with Antonio the merchant, the forfeit of which is a pound of flesh if the money he has lent is not repaid by a certain date. The date has passed, so Shylock takes himself simply to be claiming a legal right, something that is due to him. So he's claiming that his cause is juridical, that's to say, there's something that's rightful and lawful here, and he's claiming that his cause is absolute. That's to say that what he's pleading for is simply his right. So here is the Duke, beginning
the interlocution with Shylock. How shalt thou hope for mercy, rendering none? Shylock, what judgment shall I dread? Doing no wrong. Secondly, Shylock also claims to be acting jure, that's to say in accordance with law, and justly. And here is his great opening. I have possessed your grace of what I purpose, and by our holy Sabbath I have sworn to have the due and forfeit of my bond. And he reiterates the claim in the final request to the Duke in the speech. This pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. It's legal. Simply laying claim to what is his. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. All right, the next general question, as you remember, is about the standing of this demand, the standing of the cause. Now, no one ever suggests that Shylock's cause is turpis, is inherently foul. They can't, because it's a legal demand. And when Portia makes her appearance in court, the very first thing she says is, the law cannot impugn you as you do proceed. So it's not a foul cause, but the Duke is completely unwilling to agree that it's an honest cause. On the contrary, he begins by excoriating Shylock for what he calls his unnatural cruelty and his malice, and urges him to withdraw. So how should Shylock's cause be classified? Well, you remember there are only three possibilities, and here is Portia in her first words. Is your name Shylock? Shylock is my name. Of a strange nature is the suit you follow. It's a strange cause. It's not foul, but it's not honest. It is strange. Okay, the Duke agrees with this, but his point is to say, and I think this is the right way to read his opening address to Shylock, is you can change your strange cause into an honest one. It's easy for you to do that, he says to Shylock. Well, let's reflect for a moment on what it would be for Shylock's cause to be easily classifiable as honest. And that requires us for a moment to go back to the dictionaries. Honest doesn't just mean good. Notice kind and gentle, well-mannered and courteous. And there is the Duke speaking to Shylock. He wants him to be touched with human gentleness and love. He wants him to show a duty of tender courtesy. If he does that, he will be honest, and his cause will become an honest one. So now the question is, well, how does Shylock respond to the request that he present his cause in a way that makes it honest? Well, he not only vehemently refuses, but there's no other way around it. It seems to me that he produces a satire on this idea of the causes. First he refuses the idea of pursuing his cause with love and gentleness. He says, I bear a lodged hatred towards Antonio. But much more vehement is his refusal to act with courtesy. He wants tender courtesy. And notice, being honest as well-mannered, courteous. Now, Shylock knows that this is what is expected. You'll ask me why I rather choose to have a weight of carrion flesh than to receive 3,000 ducats. Well, indeed, they might well ask. But his reply is, there's no reason. There's no reason for that preference. And I'm not obliged to give a reason. It's mine. It's by right. I don't have to give any further reason. And he pushes that point home. It's a famous part of his speech, with some comparisons. Some men, there are love not a gaping pig, some that are mad if they behold a cat, and others, when the bagpipes sing in the nose, cannot contain their urine. He's saying there's no reason for any of these things, and just as the same way, there's no particular reason for him to pursue his case. And so the Duke says, we want tender courtesy. And Shylock responds by talking about pigs, cats, bagpipes, and an irrepressible desire to urinate. He's showing absolute contempt for everything that Cicero tells you to do. He's showing contempt for the court. He knows the rules, but he's refusing them. And he can do that because he thinks his cause is absolute. Okay, there's the preliminaries, and now Portia enters, and the trial gets underway. And here is Portia. Of a strange nature is the suit you follow, yet in such rule that the Venetian law cannot impugn you as you do proceed. You stand within his danger, do you not? Aye, so he says. Do you confess the bond? I do. Notice Portia admits that Shylock's cause is juridical. The only question is what the law prescribes. And she also admits that his cause is absolute. He's simply claiming a right. The law cannot impugn him. So the only plea she can enter on Antonio's behalf, if she knows her Cicero, which she clearly does, is a confessio. And she can't ask for a confessio in the form of a purgatio because she's just said to Antonio, do you confess the bond? And he says, yes, I do. That's to say, I consented to the bond. So no purgatio. She's just got to plead for forgiveness. She's just got to ask for mercy. Do you confess the bond? I do. Then must the Jew be merciful. All that can be said. And then Shylock, on what compulsion must I? Tell me that. Well, we know what Cicero advises at this point. He says, now, there's only one thing you can do. Loci communes. And she moves straight into one of the most famous speeches Shakespeare ever wrote, Portia's plea for mercy. Now, this is very sudden, and a number of critics, even Professor Danson in his excellent monograph, characterizes the oration which immediately follows from Portia, I quote, as a magnificent irrelevance. Wow, that's as bad as it gets. I mean, this is what you have to do. This is what the whole of the part, you're in a position in which that's the only thing you can do, and you must do it at once, Cicero says. Don't mess around. Do the best you can with the Loci communes. Now, these are in compilations, as I've said. This is a big Elizabethan genre of writing. And I have to say that what I don't think has been noticed by critics writing about this scene is that all that Portia does is to quote from a number of very well-known commonplace books. One is John Locke, the Book of Wisdom. He which shall have mercy of another, looking it up under mercy, what do you find? He shall find mercy for himself. Or Thomas Cogan, the Well of Wisdom. He that is merciful doth himself a benefit. Portia, it is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. Here's another, Robert Hitchcock, The Criticisms of Wit. Clemency is a thing proper and particular to great and worthy minds. Or, the most famous of all the commonplace books, Mirandula Sententia, mercy alone makes us equal to the gods. Portia, it is mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throne of monarch better than his crown. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly powers doth then show like as gods when mercy seasons justice. Well, of course, it's turned into spectacular verse, but these are the Locke communes. Here's Cogan again. He that showeth no mercy, how dare he ask forgiveness of his sins? Or here's John Locke again. Our Lord Jesus saith, pardon others gladly, if thou wilt have pardon. And here is Portia. Though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Well, Portia's speech, of course, is celebrated for its eloquence, and rightly, but notice that I mean, she's done exactly what Cicero says. Go for the most, they all believe this, they're all important, everyone already knows this, they've all read these books, just go for it. But notice these are all Christian and classical commonplaces. They make no impression on Shylock, and not surprisingly, it's one of the racial moments in the scene. Why should he pay attention to these commonplaces? And here is his reply. My deeds upon my head, I crave the law, penalty, and forfeit of my bond. So he rejects the plea for mercy. It doesn't make sense to him, and why should it? Well, Portia accepts it, and she says, if thou follow this strict court of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant there. Bassanio then famously calls on her. He says, twist the law to our purposes you must. She says it must not be. There is no power in Venice can alter a degree established. Shylock, a Daniel come to judgment. Yea, a Daniel. So it's over. And there's the great dramatic tension. It was an absolute cause. It was only an assumptive plea. It could only be a plea for mercy. Portia produces all the Locke communes. They don't work. So that's it. Absolute cause. Shylock, a Daniel come to judgment. If thou follow this strict court of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant there. Bassanio then famously calls on her. He says, twist the law to our purposes you must. She says it must not be. There is no power in Venice can alter a degree established. Shylock, a Daniel come to judgment. Yea, a Daniel. So it's over. And there's the great dramatic tension. It was an absolute cause. It was only an assumptive plea. It could only be a plea for mercy. Portia produces all the Locke communes. They don't work. So that's it. I pray you let me look upon the bond as Portia's very next words. And Portia is giving us notice here. Some critics, very ingeniously, perhaps too ingeniously, remind us that the Latin word for a door is porta, a portal. Suddenly a new vista opens. I pray you let me look upon the bond. Now, what she's pointing out is that although it is, of course, a juridical constitution, it's about right, nevertheless, there is a text. It's founded on a text, and so we need to have an interpretation of the relevant legal document. Now, at first, it doesn't look as if this is going to make any difference. She looks at it, and what does she say? Why, this bond is forfeit, and lawfully by this the Jew may claim a pound of flesh, to be by him cut off nearest the merchant's heart. Shylock, O noble judge, O excellent young man. However, by this stage, I mean, I took you through a crash course in rhetorical instruction, so you're all thinking, oh dear, this is not going well for Shylock. I mean, you already see that something is going very badly wrong for Shylock. It's dangerously premature, O noble judge. Shylock, and this I think is critical to the whole scene, seems oblivious of the fact that if the question now before the court is how should the bond be interpreted, how should the text be interpreted, he's got to move with great circumspection, because remember Cicero told us, look, there are two things you really got to worry about if what's at issue is the interpretation of a text. And the first, you remember, was, are you going to take your stand exclusively on the verba ipsa, the very words? Are you going to just, like the Archbishop, you're going to say, look, let's look at this text, just see exactly what it says? Or are you going to ask about underlying intentions and purposes? Now, it's a very strange feature of the scene that Portia goes, she prefers the latter form of interpretation. And in a way, I mean, Shylock is hearing that. She always wants a balance. And when she initially concedes the lawfulness of the bond, it's in part, of course, because of the wording, but also because of this. The intent and, I mean, she's quoting Cicero again, the intent and purpose of the law hath full relation to the bond penalty, that here appeareth due upon the bond. There is an underlying law, the intent and purpose of which is to make sure that bonds are rightfully upheld. And later, in a very strange little passage, you remember, she reaffirms this. Have by some surgeon, Shylock, on your charge to stop the wounds, lest he too bleed to death. So she's conceding. It's not mentioned in the bond, but she's saying the words of the bond, that's not the only thing that you should take account of. It is not so expressed. But what of that? To a good you do so much for charity. Shylock, by contrast, always insists on the exact wording. I stay here on my bond. And when Portia says, and I've quoted it, that this allows him to cut a pound of flesh nearest the merchant's heart, what he does is he relishes the exactitude of this. Aye, his breast, so says the bond, doth it not, noble judge, nearest the heart. And then he quotes Cicero. Those are the verba ipsa. Those are the very words. And that's why he refuses the surgeon. I cannot find it. It is not in the bond. Okay, that's a disastrous mistake. He should not go for the words. Portia is now able to reiterate her verdict, and she presents it in two parts. First, she allows the pound of flesh. The court awards it, and the Lord doth give it. And you must cut this flesh from off his breast. The law allows it, and the court awards it. Notice how rhetorical it is. Court, law, law, court. Very emphatic. It's called epanados. So Shylock turns at once to Antonio. Come, prepare. Portia interrupts to deliver the second part of her verdict. Some of the best-known lines in Shakespeare. Tarry a little, there is something else. This bond doth give thee here no jot of blood. The words expressly are, the verba ipsa, a pound of flesh. So the disasters of having gone for the very words are revealed. As Cicero said, I quote him, take care to insist on the underlying purpose of any legal arrangement, for then you can argue that something which seems inherently obvious does not need to be expressly stated. Now, if Shylock had gone that way, he could have claimed that it's obvious that if you're going to take a pound of flesh, there's going to be blood. So that doesn't have to be said. That's too obvious to need saying. That's what he should have said. Cicero would have advised. Now, as you know, the overwhelming number of critics have taken that to be the turning point in the scene. I quote Danson again, Shylock's bond now turns out to be unenforceable. The penalty is impossible to exact. And that could be duplicated elsewhere. Mahoud says that in his edition of the play, Brown in his edition, Keaton in his monograph on the legalities of the scene. But I want to end by saying that they don't seem to me to have understood the sources and hence the structure of the scene. To treat that moment about the pound of flesh as pivotal, which I think people do, is to overlook the most essential point in Portia's case and shows that she really is a master or rather mistress of the Ciceronian story. And to appreciate this further element, you have to remember what I was saying. There are two things that you have to be aware of when you've got a constitutio negotialis. One is, do you want intentions and purposes to be considered or just the verba ipsa? But and of course, if Shylock had gone that way, that would have helped him, but it would not have helped him enough because there's a second issue, which is there a contrary law? Remember, Cicero says, you must ask yourself, is there going to be any law such that, although this bond may be completely lawful, I lose my case because there is a contrary law that is superior to it. Now, it's clear from the way that Shylock presents his case, and this is what Portia notices, is that he's not asked himself that question. And that is the fatality of the scene. And so here is the actual fulcrum of the scene. He can enforce it, of course he can. Take then thy bond, take thou thy pound of flesh, but in the cutting it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are, by the laws of Venice, confiscate unto the state of Venice. Shylock is stunned. Is that the law? Portia, thyself shall see the act. Well, I'm finishing. This is how I understand the scene, and it takes us straight back to Cicero. As we saw, Cicero particularly admonishes you to make sure that your cause is not subject to being overturned by a contrary law, I quote, that deals with more important matters, since that is the law that will be upheld by the court. And it's Shylock's failure to heed this piece of advice that enables Portia to triumph over him. As she admits throughout the trial, the law in Venice extends to the protection of aliens, like Shylock, so that he has private rights. Of course, it's a commercial city. Aliens must have private rights in commerce that are respected. But such rights are subject to public law, and thus to the provisions of acts of the state that are designed to prevent citizens from coming to harm. Now, it is extraordinary that Shylock doesn't know that there is a contrary law that protects Christians in this way. He seems not to know that. And that is the real fulcrum. He should know that, but he seems not to. But it's quite wrong to say that that leaves his bond impossible to execute. He can still insist on the bond, and Portia invites him to do so. Take, then, thou pound of flesh. But if he does so, he acts in contravention of the contrary law, and so he has to pay the penalty, which is the forfeiture of entire estate. And the reason why that's the turning point is that Portia has guessed, notice that's all she's done, but she has correctly guessed that when he learns the penalty, he will withdraw the case. It's not unenforceable, but he is going to have to decide whether to enforce it. And he decides not. Instead, he pleads for mercy. So there's the beautiful symmetry of the scene. Now Shylock pleads for mercy. Portia, who's just made the most famous plea for mercy in the English language, immediately refuses it. She's sort of forgotten what she was saying because she's just a lawyer after all. She was just going through the best course that she can. Shall I not have barely my principal? Thou shalt have nothing but the forfeiture, to be so taken at thy peril, Jew. Why then, the devil give him good of it. I'll stay no longer. Question. The question to which Shylock here refers is the quaestio he brought before the court, which is, should he be allowed to enforce his penal bond? Notice, he's withdrawn the question, so there is nothing left for him to say. I'll stay no longer question. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely.